Welcome to the Raul effect. If you've ever wondered what really changes when you stop chasing an avoidant, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the truth together. Have you ever wondered why an avoidant often seems unaffected until you finally stop chasing? What changes inside them isn't always visible, but it can be far more powerful than most people realize. Sometimes your silence says what years of explaining never could. Let's explore what really happens beneath the surface when you finally choose yourself. Something shifted, and you probably felt it before you could even put it into words. The dynamic between you and the person who once made you believe you always had to be the one adjusting began to change. For so long, you were the one shrinking yourself to keep the relationship alive. You held back your needs, buried your emotions, and lowered your expectations because you believed that was the price of staying connected. Then, without any dramatic moment, something changed within you. There was no final speech, no emotional confrontation, and no attempt to make them understand your pain. You simply stopped carrying the relationship on your shoulders. You stopped chasing. You stopped explaining yourself over and over. You stopped being endlessly available to someone who had grown used to your loyalty without fully appreciating its value. That quiet decision created an effect neither of you expected. The moment your constant presence disappeared, it reached a place inside them that all of their emotional defenses were never prepared to protect. Avoidant people often spend years learning how to guard themselves against emotional closeness. They become skilled at creating distance whenever intimacy feels overwhelming. They build emotional walls to avoid vulnerability, dependence, and the uncertainty that comes with deep connection. They know how to protect themselves from love. They know how to manage someone else's emotional needs. They know how to create distance when someone reaches for them. What they rarely prepare for is the possibility that the person who always stayed might one day stop showing up. Their defenses were built to handle your affection, your patience, and your desire to stay connected. They were never built to handle losing access to you completely. After all, your presence had always seemed certain. It became part of the background of their life, something they unconsciously assumed would always be there. Now that it isn't, their emotional world struggles to adjust. Your silence begins revealing weaknesses in places they once believed were solid. It unsettles them. It humbles them. In many situations, it creates frustration and emotional discomfort they don't know how to deal with. Before going further, one important truth needs to be understood. This is not advice meant to manipulate someone into missing you. It isn't a strategy to make them come back. It isn't about using silence as a weapon or creating pain so they finally notice your worth. If your silence is genuine, if it comes from realizing that chasing someone who repeatedly pulls away has become emotionally exhausting, then its value has nothing to do with how they respond. The greatest benefit belongs to you. Your healing belongs to you. Your self-respect belongs to you. Your decision to stop settling for less than you deserve belongs to you. Whether they experience regret, confusion, sadness, or no reaction at all doesn't change the importance of that choice. Their emotional experience is not the main story anymore. Yours is. The moment your silence becomes an attempt to control their feelings, you've quietly placed them back at the center of your life. You've already spent enough time doing that. So what actually happens inside an avoidant when the one person who always remained patient, always stayed available, and always invested in the relationship suddenly becomes silent? The first reaction is often disbelief. Not necessarily in a conscious way, but deep beneath the surface. Their understanding of the relationship had been built around your consistency. You were the dependable one. You stayed connected. You came back after distance. You continued giving emotional effort even when very little was returned. Over time, your presence became part of how they believed the relationship naturally worked. This wasn't always driven by selfishness or intentional disregard. Often it simply developed through repetition. You were always there. Eventually, their mind accepted your presence as something permanent. When that pattern suddenly disappears, their internal expectations no longer match reality. For someone who depends on carefully controlling emotional distance to feel safe, this creates a major disruption. The emotional structure they relied on begins to shake. A source of stability they unconsciously counted on is no longer available, and that absence sends tension throughout their entire emotional system. After disbelief comes confusion. Not because they fail to understand why you stopped trying. Most avoidant people recognize, at least on an intellectual level, why someone eventually reaches their limit. They saw the emotional distance. They recognized the inconsistency. They were aware of the repeated cycle of closeness followed by withdrawal. Somewhere inside, they knew the day might eventually come when you would choose yourself. The confusing part isn't understanding your decision. The confusing part is experiencing its emotional impact. Their mind can explain exactly what happened, but their nervous system struggles to accept that you're truly gone. Those are two completely different experiences. They can make sense of the situation logically, yet they can't easily explain why your absence suddenly feels so heavy. That creates a deeply unsettling conflict. Many avoidant individuals learn to manage difficult emotions by analyzing them. They think through them, rationalize them, and explain them away. But now they find themselves facing emotions that refuse to stay inside those logical boundaries. They understand the facts, yet the emotional ache remains. And that is what catches them off guard. They believed they could handle the loss. Maybe they convinced themselves they had moved on from other relationships before. Maybe they had become experts at appearing unaffected. But your silence carries a weight they never truly expected. And for the first time, logic alone is no longer enough to make those feelings disappear. What makes this loss different is that it isn't just the end of a relationship. It's the loss of someone who consistently offered real love, patience, and emotional safety. That kind of absence has a weight many people don't expect. Then another emotion often begins to surface, one that few people ever see: embarrassment. Avoidant individuals rarely show embarrassment openly. More often they deal with it alone, away from anyone else's view. It grows from a difficult realization that the way they behaved doesn't fully match the person they believe themselves to be. Deep down, many avoidant people genuinely want to think of themselves as caring, kind, and capable of healthy love. They don't usually see themselves as people who intentionally hurt others. But your silence becomes impossible to ignore. It acts like a mirror, and mirrors don't argue back. For a long time, it was easier to explain the relationship in ways that protected them. They could convince themselves you were overly emotional or too demanding. They could focus on your reactions instead of their own distance. Every time you expressed hurt, the attention stayed on your pain instead of their withdrawal. But once you stop reaching, those explanations lose their strength. The story changes because the evidence they once relied on is no longer there. Instead of focusing on your efforts, they're left looking at their own choices. That is where embarrassment often begins. As long as you kept trying, they had something outside themselves to respond to. Your emotions became the focus. Your pursuit gave them something to step away from. Your efforts kept the attention on the relationship instead of on themselves. Silence changes that completely. There is no emotional intensity to dismiss, no pursuit to avoid, no visible need to blame for the growing distance. Without those distractions, they're left alone with a clearer picture of their own behavior. That is why silence often reaches places long conversations never could. It's not because your words weren't true or your feelings weren't valid. It's because words can be debated, explained away, or ignored. Silence simply exists. Soon after, another emotion often appears: anger. This reaction is frequently misunderstood. People wonder why someone would become angry after you finally stopped chasing them or chose your own peace. In most cases, the anger isn't really directed at you. It's directed at the uncomfortable emotions your silence brings to the surface. Avoidant individuals often struggle most with emotions that require honest self-reflection. Feelings such as guilt, regret, responsibility, and shame ask them to become vulnerable. And vulnerability is exactly what their protective patterns have spent years avoiding. Admitting, "I played a part in this," or "my choices helped create this outcome," is emotionally difficult. Accepting the consequences of those choices is even harder. That level of accountability takes courage. When facing those emotions feels overwhelming, anger often becomes a defense. It creates distance from guilt and protects them from fully experiencing the possibility that they damaged something valuable through their own actions. There is another reason this anger can appear. Throughout much of the relationship, especially during periods when they pulled away, They often held the emotional advantage, not because they intentionally wanted control, but because they appeared less dependent on the relationship. They looked calmer, less affected, and more comfortable with distance. Meanwhile, you carried the emotional weight. In many relationships, the person who seems less attached naturally holds more influence because the person who cares more is taking greater emotional risks. For a long time, that balance remained the same. Then, everything shifted. You stopped proving that you would always be there. You stopped offering constant reassurance. You stopped making your availability feel guaranteed. Suddenly, they had to face something they hadn't fully considered. You can live without them. You can step away. You can choose your own well-being. That realization changes the emotional balance completely. The sense of certainty they unconsciously depended on begins to disappear. The relationship no longer follows the pattern they expected. And whenever people lose a feeling of control they assumed they had, discomfort often follows. Sometimes that discomfort shows itself as anger. Your silence also creates another painful realization. It forces them to see themselves more honestly. As old excuses lose their power, they're left looking at how they handled the relationship, where fear shaped their decisions, how often they avoided closeness, and how many opportunities for genuine connection quietly slipped away. Most avoidant people aren't unaware of what healthy love looks like. They understand consistency, reliability, emotional presence, and mutual effort. The challenge has rarely been understanding those qualities. The challenge has been living them when intimacy feels frightening. Your silence highlights the gap between the partner they hoped to be and the partner they actually became. That gap is deeply uncomfortable. While you remained present, there was always enough noise to avoid facing it directly. Once you're gone, much of that noise disappears, leaving very little to hide behind. As disbelief, embarrassment, and anger begin mixing together, another pattern often develops. They quietly start looking for pieces of information about you. They may ask mutual friends how you're doing. They may notice whether you still visit familiar places. They may pay attention to small updates connected to your life while pretending none of it matters. But if it truly meant nothing, they wouldn't be searching in the first place. Your silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty naturally creates anxiety. They want to know whether you've truly moved on, whether your silence is permanent, and whether you still think about them. Yet asking those questions directly requires vulnerability. It means admitting that your absence affects them. For someone who struggles with emotional exposure, that can feel incredibly difficult. So instead, they watch from a distance. And in a strange way, that quiet observation becomes its own form of reaching, a hidden attempt to stay connected while still appearing emotionally detached. The embarrassment often becomes connected to very specific memories. They begin remembering all the moments when your love felt guaranteed. Your care, patience, and loyalty became something they quietly expected would always be there, no matter how often they created distance. Your presence became part of the emotional foundation of their life, and only after it's gone do they realize how much they depended on it. They start recalling the times your pain was obvious. They remember the conversations where your need for closeness couldn't have been clearer, and the moments your disappointment showed on your face. Yet even after seeing those things, they still chose emotional safety over vulnerability, distance over connection, and withdrawal over showing up. Those memories become difficult to carry. Another realization often follows. They may begin recognizing that they treated your ability to love as though it were the problem. Your openness felt overwhelming. Your emotional honesty felt like pressure. Your desire for connection seemed like too much. But with time and distance, those explanations become harder to believe. Your silence gathers all of those memories together, creating a picture that's much harder to ignore. At that point, anger often builds one final layer of protection. The story starts getting rewritten. Your mistakes suddenly seem much bigger than they once were. Every emotional reaction becomes evidence supporting their version of events. Every imperfect moment is used to justify why things unfolded the way they did. That doesn't mean your flaws never existed. You're human, just like everyone else. But focusing on your imperfections can become a way of avoiding their own. It's a psychological defense. If enough responsibility is placed on you, they don't have to fully sit with the discomfort of looking at themselves. None of that changes what actually happened. You know how much of yourself you invested. You know how many chances you gave. You know how emotionally exhausting it became to keep hoping things would eventually be different. And you know exactly why you finally chose peace instead of repeating the same painful cycle. That truth belongs to you. No matter how the story gets rewritten, it doesn't erase your experience. Sometimes that final layer of anger doesn't even look like anger. It looks like indifference. But it's often an indifference that's performed loudly enough to be noticed. One of the strongest signs your silence has had an impact isn't always a direct message or an attempt to reconnect. Sometimes it's a carefully presented image showing how perfectly fine they seem. Suddenly they appear incredibly busy, successful, fulfilled, and completely focused on moving forward. Everything looks polished. Everything seems effortless. Yet something about it often feels overly intentional. It appears in places where you're likely to see it. Real indifference usually doesn't need an audience. When someone has genuinely moved on, they simply live their life. They don't need to convince anyone. Performance is different because performance always requires effort. Beneath it is often one quiet question. Are you still watching? And maybe an even deeper one. Do you feel anything when you see me? If you notice this behavior, don't automatically mistake it for healing. Sometimes it's simply pride protecting a much more vulnerable reality. Looking unaffected often feels safer than admitting someone still matters. Meanwhile, something much deeper is happening inside. Your silence begins challenging the identity they've built over many years. Many avoidant people see themselves as fiercely independent, emotionally self-contained, and capable of handling everything without needing anyone else. Over time, that image becomes part of who they believe they are. But your absence exposes something they hadn't fully considered. Their independence was often experienced alongside your constant investment. They looked detached because you kept reaching. They seemed emotionally steady because you carried the emotional weight. They appeared self-sufficient because you continued holding the relationship together. Now that comparison is gone. For the first time, they're left alone with their own version of independence. And in that quiet space, another feeling often rises: loneliness. Not ordinary loneliness, but the loneliness that comes from spending years protecting yourself from the very connection you secretly wanted. For so long, distance was something they controlled. Space was something they chose. Withdrawal was something they managed. Now they're experiencing absence from the opposite side, and it feels completely different. This is where the deepest humbling often begins. Not through embarrassment, not through anger, but through experiencing something very familiar to you. They begin discovering what it feels like to want someone they can no longer reach, to think about someone without knowing where those thoughts belong, to feel emotional longing while certainty has disappeared. You lived with those feelings for a long time. You carried the uncertainty. You sat with the confusion. You loved someone who wasn't always emotionally available. Now they may finally understand that experience, not through explanation, but through living it. Reading about pain and feeling pain are never the same. Real understanding often begins only when it becomes personal. What happens after that depends entirely on the individual. For some avoidant people, this loss becomes the moment everything starts changing. The discomfort becomes too great to ignore. Reflection replaces avoidance. They slowly begin facing the fears beneath their behavior and learning emotional skills they never developed before. The process isn't quick or perfect. Growth is uncomfortable. But sometimes losing someone becomes the very event that finally opens the door to change. For others, the opposite happens. As time passes, the discomfort becomes easier to manage. Old defenses slowly return. New explanations replace honest reflection. They find a story that feels safer because it asks less of them. Not because change wasn't possible, because change is always a choice. Some people choose familiarity instead of transformation. Some choose protection instead of vulnerability. Some remain inside the identity they've always known because growth asks them to step into uncertainty. Which path they choose is not yours to control. You cannot create their breakthrough. You cannot carefully manage your silence, hoping it produces the perfect outcome. The moment you begin doing that, you've stepped back into the same exhausting pattern. Their healing belongs to them. Their decisions belong to them. Their accountability belongs to them. What belongs to you is something far more valuable. When your silence comes from genuine self-respect, it gives you something years of explaining, waiting, hoping, and understanding never could. It gives you yourself back. Little by little, you notice your mind becoming quieter. Entire days pass without the relationship consuming every thought. Your emotional energy starts returning to where it always belonged. You begin remembering what healthy love actually feels like. The pieces of yourself that disappeared while trying to save the relationship slowly return. And that's the real victory. It's the return to your own center. Whether they grow or stay exactly the same doesn't change that. Whether they contact you or never speak again doesn't change that. Whether they finally understand your value or never fully do doesn't change that either. For too long, you carried patience for wounds you couldn't heal. You kept offering understanding even when it meant abandoning your own well-being. Eventually, compassion stopped being healthy. It became self-abandonment wearing the mask of empathy. Then you became quiet. Not to punish, not to manipulate, not to make them suffer, but because you finally created a boundary. And once your constant effort disappeared, the relationship revealed what it had truly been all along. Now they must live with whatever emotions that reality brings. Those emotions aren't punishment, they're simply the natural consequences of choices. Whether they use them to grow is entirely up to them. Your journey leads somewhere else, toward relationships where love doesn't constantly leave you questioning your worth, toward people who show care consistently instead of only during rare emotional moments, toward a life where your presence is appreciated while you're still there, not only after you've walked away. That was always the real purpose of your silence, not changing them, changing the direction of your own life, rebuilding it around your worth instead of your sacrifice, learning what becomes possible once you stop chasing relationships that continually ask you to abandon yourself. Keep walking in that direction. Everything waiting for you on the other side is worth every difficult step it took to get there. Because in the end, your silence was never meant to make them miss you. It was never about creating regret or finally convincing them of your value. It was about choosing yourself after spending far too long choosing a relationship that repeatedly cost you your peace. Whether they grow or remain exactly where they are is part of their journey. Your journey began the moment you stopped leaving yourself behind in hopes of being loved differently. That silence became the first chapter of your healing, the rebuilding of your self-worth, and the reminder that real love never requires endless chasing, constant explaining, or proving your value. The day you chose yourself was the day you finally started moving toward the peace, the love, and the life you truly deserve. Your silence was never meant to change them. It was meant to bring you back to yourself. Whether an avoidant grows from the loss or stays the same is their choice, not your responsibility. The greatest victory isn't making someone realize your worth, it's realizing you never had to prove it in the first place. When you choose your own peace, you make room for the kind of love that never asks you to abandon yourself.